From the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University on the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because it's an opportunity to talk with a cardiologist author who I greatly admire and whose work I've enjoyed reading over the last several years. On these podcasts, we get into current science topics, we get into health policy topics, but we also try to introduce you to some of the people in cardiovascular medicine who are maybe approaching the world of medicine from a different vantage point, as opposed to from a strictly scientific/research vantage point or strictly from a clinical observation standpoint. I'm really honored to have joined me today Dr. Lisa Rosenbaum. Dr. Rosenbaum is a national correspondent for the New England Journal of Medicine. She's also an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and she is a practicing cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Lisa, thank you very much for joining us here today on Medscape Cardiology.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very intrigued by cardiologists who either became authors or authors who became cardiologists. It's a special skill set that you bring to the world of medicine. Can you give us a little bit of your background? And let's even go early. Let's talk about where you grew up, where you went to college, medical school.
So I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I am the daughter of physician parents. My father is a rheumatologist and studies ocular inflammation, uveitis. And as you know, my mom is a cardiologist, and my grandfather was also a physician, and I'll sort of get to him in a moment.
I have to do my full disclosure that your mom and I are good buddies. So that's not why you're on the phone here. You have tremendous accomplishments on your own, but your mother is someone who I admire greatly. So thank you for mentioning her.
Well, you have good taste. I love her too. So anyway, I grew up in Portland, and I went to Stanford for undergraduate, and I always wanted to be a doctor, so I didn't really think about doing anything else. And then I think around my junior year, I had probably my first real heartbreak, and in order to deal with it, I took a fiction writing class, and I totally fell in love with writing. It was really cathartic. I made all these amazing friends. And I sort of got obsessed with writing and fiction and the short story. And so by then I had done most of my pre-med requirements, and sort of on a whim I applied to do an MFA in fiction writing and ended up going to Columbia for that right after I graduated college. I got there the week before September 11th in 2001.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it ended up being a really, really hard year, and I got really depressed and spent a lot of time just trying to make sense of the world. I literally did not write a word. I mean, I was like finally in this program where writing could be my life, and I couldn't do anything. And so I applied to medical school and dropped out of the program and ended up at UCSF for medical school, which was wonderful. But I still sort of had this itch to be creative, and I think at some point in that process, it became clear to me that medicine is so rich, there are so many stories to tell, that it didn't make sense to keep trying to invent stories when I could be talking about the real world. And during this time, my grandfather, who was a rheumatologist in Portland, Oregon, decided he wanted to write a book with me. So a little background on him. When he was 70, he got a cold that wouldn't go away and ended up 6 months later, after being told his illness was all psychological, being diagnosed with laryngeal cancer. And he underwent treatment, which was successful. And then he returned to practice, and he was really disappointed by the state of medicine, having been on the other side. And so he wrote a book about it called A Taste of My Own Medicine. And I think it was published in the late 80s or so. And then in 1992, Disney made it into the movie The Doctor, starring William Hurt.
Wow, I didn't know that. I remember that movie. Yeah.
My dad and I always joke that it was sort of like the best movie ever not to win an Oscar. I mean, we really liked it.
I do remember that movie now that you say that. Yeah, that's terrific.
I try to watch it once every few years. It's really good. So after that, so he'd had, real success and lectured all over the world about meaning in medicine, and the day I got into medical school, so there are 6 grandkids on the Rosenbaum side, and at that point, I was the only one in medicine, even though 3 of his sons are also doctors, and the 4th is an attorney. So he started writing me all of these letters, and he had this idea that we were going to fix medicine through this exchange of letters about basically all of these sort of ethical issues and challenges in medicine. And that was this basically something that was incredibly meaningful to me, but also was not coherent in terms of something that I could publish. So during this time, he was in his 80s. He ended up getting Parkinson's disease and basically got progressively demented, but just kept this up. He lost his ability to write. I have these binders he sent me with my name scrawled in his writing, and then he ended up hiring somebody so he could just dictate and just keep telling me these stories. And the point of all this is to say, well, the point is twofold. One is that there was this inherent meaning in writing for me because it was with him. And so rather than focusing on publishing, I just was sort of focused on my relationship with him and knowing that he wasn't going to be around forever. And he died at 94, maybe a month, I think, before I finished residency.
It's really fascinating, Lisa, because it's reminiscent of books like Letters to a Young Doctor.
Yeah.
But here it is, it's the grandfather to the granddaughter who's a medical student. That's incredibly powerful.
I thought so. I think at some point my dad said to me, because all I would ever do is write about my grandfather. It was ridiculous, honestly. And I think at some point, and my dad loved him as much as I did, he said, you might want to move beyond the whole Papa conceit, and he was right. And I think that was an important thing to do at some point. But actually now, this is skipping ahead. So now I have all this material, and I never could figure out how to bring it all together. And then at some point I realized that I was trying too hard with each story to figure out what the theme of the story was, and what I realized was that what mattered was that the story existed, because for him, all these stories were stories he carried about his patients that he'd cared for 50 years, and he held on to them, and that his legacy was about passing them along. And to me, that is this aspect of medicine also that's now gone missing. And so I have this idea to write a book, which I've been saying for years, but now I'm really committed to doing it, and sort of framing the book with that theme so that I can write about him and share some of his stories, but also sort of in the middle figure out what happened to medicine. Why can't we practice like that anymore?
Good friends. I've interviewed him before, my colleague Abraham Verghese, the author, and something you said really reminds me of something he and I talk about a lot, which is that writing is work, and you have to constantly work on your craft. And it sounds like that the early days of you writing back and forth with your grandfather, writing about your grandfather, you were honing your craft and being able to develop your voice and be able to develop a style of writing that then has served you going forward. Abraham and I often talk, he's very envious of his colleagues who can turn out the book every July. He says, I just can't do that. It's work for me, and it's going to take 3, 4, 5. I think Cutting for Stone took 8 years. Do you have the similar thing that you really feel like it's work for you?
Yes. I mean, intensely it feels like work. And to the point that I prefer seeing patients. Not that that's not work. It's a different sort of work, but it's a work that gives you such utter clarity in terms of your sense of purpose is clear. You know that your day is going to be busy, that you just go until you can't go anymore. Whereas with writing, I'm constantly battling this sense of, should I keep going? Is this good? If you ever talk to my mom, she says I do this every essay I write, where I send it to her at some point and say, should I just quit? And she says, no. And then she says, you do this every time. And it's true. I do. I mean, I never get to the point where I think, okay, I got this. And I haven't written a book yet, and I've been saying I'm going to. And the challenge for me is figuring out the arc. I don't know exactly what it's like for other people, but I often find that I don't know the point of the essay until I get to the end. And so the book challenge for me is also wondering whether I just need to write the book to figure out what it's about. But that just feels like a massive project.
I don't write as you do. I write a lot of viewpoints and editorials and that sort of things, but I sort of stick to my lane. But when I do talk to Abraham, I do realize that he says a lot of similar things to you, which is that he often doesn't know where the story's going until he sort of tells it. And it is this process. And it's interesting that a lot of medical students, college students, they come to see him. Sometimes they come to see me to talk about internal medicine specifically or cardiology specifically. And there's sometimes a sense that you can just dive into this. And I'm always glad to hear from people like you how hard this is, because it is work that you've got to practice over the years, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. And I don't mean that as a complaint. I would pay to get to do this. I mean, it's thrilling for me. And what you said about how I was honing the craft in medical school, for instance, my whole fourth year, I just remember getting up as early as possible, going for a run, and then going to a coffee shop and just writing forever. And I didn't publish any of that. It was so bad. It felt like the right thing to do and what I wanted to be doing.
Yeah, because you felt like you had to do it, that this was
Yeah.
part of who you were. It's interesting, several years ago, one of my colleagues at Stanford sent his Stanford undergraduate daughter to meet with her to talk about her future. She was thinking of medical school, but she was also thinking about writing. He and his wife both are basic scientists, and he thought they'd send him to me, and I would like disavow this notion of writing and set her straight. And so you might imagine she came to see me, and she was this very enthusiastic young woman who's interested in creative writing. And I said, well, you should do that.
Yeah.
She started laughing. She said, my dad sent me to see you to tell me that I should do like biology. I said, no. You should write. And if you want to come to medicine later or as part of that, that's great. But don't feel constrained by that. And I said, medicine needs more people who tell stories and who can help us all deal with issues in medicine through storytelling.
Right. I mean, I think so in a very, self-aggrandizing way, but I agree.
Well, tell me how you started writing for the New England Journal. In our world of science, there's not a bigger platform. We've got New England Journal and JAMA as our big general medicine platforms, and you're writing in one of the biggest.
I got extremely lucky, but so the way it happened was that I did residency and then fellowship, and then my third-year fellowship I spent at the New England Journal. They offer a fellowship every year, and what they call an editorial fellowship. And so this was in 2012. So this was 11 years after I had that failed year of Missouri. But I had training in medicine under my belt and was a little more grown up, I think. And so it was this opportunity. And I said at the outset of that process that I wanted to write perspectives that year. And I got really lucky to be paired with Daniela Lamas. You probably know, do you know her dad? Tony Lamas.
Oh, yeah, I know Tony pretty well.
Yeah. So Daniela had been an editor at the Crimson, and she had all these repertorial skills that I completely lacked. And we're in this office together. She's also just an incredible human and so funny and smart. And so we got to spend a lot of time together, and we got to write together. And I learned so much from her in terms of actually how to think about reporting and investigative journalism. Plus, it was just fun. But what I also learned in terms of my own life and ambitions was that I could structure my life around writing. Like that could be fruitful instead of misery. So I got to know the editors that year, and then I had already matched at that point for the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program at Penn. And I was still pretty conflicted about whether or not I wanted a research career or a writing career. And I ended up working with some of the behavioral scientists at Penn, Kevin Volb, David Ash.
I was going to ask if it was Kevin. Yeah, that great group. Yeah.
Yes. I was deeply interested and still am in emotion and risk perception. That was sort of intellectually what had always interested me, in how physicians deal with risk, how patients perceive risk, how we communicate about risk, also how we talk about it to the public. And so I ended up working with them on a project. They were studying how to improve medication adherence among patients who'd had an MI. And my role was to do this qualitative study, basically, which entailed I just talked to patients who'd had an MI about what medication taking meant to them. And it was transformative for me because what I found at the end was that I just wanted to tell people stories. That when I went to sort of write up the data, and there are methods for qualitative research, which are sort of universally accepted, but I still felt a little constrained by them, meaning I still felt like I had to make a table, and what I really wanted to do was write an essay. And so I did. I ended up writing an essay about it, but it was a moment for me in terms of, okay, if I'm always going to be looking for the stories, why am I trying to pin myself to this research career when there's something else that I clearly love so much that also seemed to reveal things that we didn't understand. And in this case, it was about what it's like for people, how they feel when we tell them to take medicines, and what it's like to have a heart attack, and all these things that are really hard to measure. The second year of the fellowship, I ended up writing for the New Yorker online. It became another year where I just spent a lot of time writing. It was also really exciting just to be at that office. I wanted to keep going, actually, and just extend the fellowship, but my parents really were like, you've done 3 fellowships, it's time to get a job. I had this idea that who would hire a cardiologist writer? I just didn't see any job that made sense. I emailed Jeff Drazen, he just retired from the New England Journal.
Yep, he was the New England Journal editor at the time, yep.
Yeah, and he'd been the person who I worked with closely. I just said, Jeff, I need advice. And then he called me the next day and he said, why don't you come work for us? And you can take an academic cardiology job wherever you want. I thought I wanted to live in New York, and it was this whole drawn-out process. And then I thought, I want to keep doing my research at Penn. But in the end, Jeff said, would you just interview at the Brigham? And I did, and I fell completely in love with it. I have this, visceral reaction to being in this division because everybody's just so talented, and I feel this awe. So here I am. And
that's a great story, and I think there's a lot of good lessons in that story for people thinking about how they want to put a career together. You got both good advice, but what do they say? Chance favors the prepared mind, and you were certainly prepared when the chance offered itself.
I definitely feel like I had a lot of luck.
Well, Lisa, we have about 5 minutes left. Let's do the following.
Okay.
I want to know how you pick some of your topics, and I'm going to group them into 3 categories, and maybe we can go through them. You're very interested in an important and serious topic of clinician burnout.
Mm-hmm.
You write a lot about what I'll call the meaning, the joy, and sometimes the not-so-joyful experiences of practicing medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're willing to take on what seems to be mainstream thought around conflicts of interest, the less is more movement. Let's start with burnout. You've written a lot, and maybe don't explicitly call it out, but you're definitely getting at the burnout issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you say that because sometimes I think Jeff used to joke with me that I, Lisa, am burned out on burnout. How do you not talk about burnout right now? If you're writing about medicine, it's on everybody's minds. But I try to write about it in a way that seems to get past the let's do yoga and Pilates or let's create another task force, but what's this really about? My fundamental sense about burnout is that we're caught in this vicious cycle. We sort of put people in roles where they're maybe in the hospital less, they're consumed by more administrative tasks, and I think that we've just completely lost sight of sort of how people derive meaning and in caring for patients and giving them the space to create relationships. And that's just, it now sounds so obvious to say that, but I don't think we're restoring that. And that feels like the most important issue to me in medicine today, that, we talk about quality in these ways that we can measure. And there's so much effort and money invested in improving quality. And there are clear ways where quality is improved. You think about guideline-directed therapy for heart failure, things like that. But I think overall, both physicians and patients sense that something so fundamental is missing, and I don't know how to get that back, but I think that's sort of the core of the burnout problem.
I think you've articulated what I've thought about for a long time, which is, as you know, I'm a very quantitative researcher and as a clinical researcher, but in my clinical practice, while I enjoy the application of evidence to practice, the older I get, the more what I enjoy in practice is sitting in the room with somebody, either in the clinic room or in the hospital room, and just talking to them about their life and what the meaning of what they're going through is. And my job is to obviously help them navigate some of the decisions that they're making. But the joy that you get is not the application of evidence to practice. The joy I get is getting that relationship and just holding someone's hand and hearing about their grandchildren. I, in some ways, have the luxury of doing that because of the job I have, but I'm with you. We got to figure out how to make that the routine practice of medicine, because that's what medicine at its core is. I tell our students, I say, look, medicine is not a science. Medicine is a human art built on scientific principles. And if you want to do science, do science. But if you want to practice medicine, it's a different type of thing.
I so agree. I think what worries me and why I feel this obligation to write about it is I feel like I carry this torch of my grandfather, my parents. In my home, medicine was a way of life. It wasn't a job.
Yeah.
And What worries me is that we've made it a job. And if you don't have that inside of you because you've seen it, you've experienced it, how do you pass that on? How do you live your life like that? And that's what worries me.
So we've talked about burnout. We've talked a little bit about joy and practice. Let's close the topic with, you've been willing to take on some pretty big issues, conflict of interest, and sort of gone against the grain, I'll say. And you've also been willing to take on less is more and write about it pretty articulately. Why do you take those on?
Well,
Because you get criticized for it.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't mind getting criticized. I know that I will get criticized when I take those issues on. I take them on because they're important. They're shaping the dialogue. I listened to your AHA presidential address, and it was beautiful. And there were so many parts of it I loved. But one thing that you talked about is trust. And this goes back to sort of the medication adherence thing. But the point is that the trust between society and the profession is so precious and so important. And what worries me about the dialogue around some of these issues is that they ostensibly are about improving public trust, but they actually consistently compromise it. And the reality is with both of these issues, conflicts of interest and with the idea that if we do less, patient care will invariably, well, that no one says invariably, but the less is more narrative, is it just completely ignores the complexity of medicine, of uncertainty, of what we don't know, of the scientific process. I do it because I think that storing that trust in the profession is also part of what will help us be more effective doctors, part of what will mitigate burnout. Someone has to take this on, and I don't mind being criticized about it. I mean, when I wrote both the series and about Less is More, I wanted to start a dialogue. It's not because I'm not a sensitive person. The thing that I always say when people ask me about this is the thing that feels worse to me in the world is when I feel like I've made a mistake that hurts a patient. That is the worst feeling in the world. But if I write something and somebody disagrees with me, who cares? It's just part of this job. I think it's important.
I'm glad you phrased it that way. I operate under the principle of my friend and colleague, Rob Califf, who, since I was a fellow in his research group, told me, look, if you're not ticking off somebody, you're probably not saying anything or doing anything interesting. You got to be willing to take on some topics that might make people uncomfortable. My whole issue is making sure that we can do that in a culture of civility and respect, which I worry about a lot. And that's what I really enjoy about your writings, is that you're willing to take on some things and you do it in an articulate, civil way, which should make us all pause and think and reflect. And again, kudos to you for helping us in the public dialogue on some really tough issues.
Well, thanks. I also kudos to my editor. Really, Debbie Molina edits me, and all the editors. I mean, when I write things like that, have a say, and I think they help tone me down sometimes.
Well, that's important to have. It's important to have a trusted editor.
Yeah.
I could talk to you all day. This is a great, great conversation for me. I've really enjoyed it. I want to thank you for joining us. My guest on Medscape Cardiology has been Dr. Lisa Rosenbaum, who is a national correspondent for the New England Journal of Medicine, assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and a cardiologist at Brigham. Lisa, thank you so much for taking time out of a busy day to join us.
Thank you so much for having me.